What is up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Fellow Show. My name's Kyle. In this video, it is June 12th. We're going to be continuing our 2024 projection series. We're going by each team, division by division, and I'm kind of just making a 15 to 20-minute video going over my preliminary projections. And again, it's early June. These are just preliminary. We're going to be tweaking them, throughout the summer and once training camps get rolling around. So I've already covered the AFC East. We're on to the NFC East now, and this video will be all about the Dallas Cowboys. It's an interesting roster build for the fantasy offense in Dallas this year. We'll talk about that in a second, but let's just get some housekeeping out of the way. If you guys want access to the fantasyfellowship.com membership, $10 a month, you guys get access to the Discord link, for now and during the whole season. You get the projection cheat sheet. You got the projections you guys can go look at there. I have data studies looking at last year's advanced data for wide receivers, running backs, tight ends, and quarterbacks. You got dynasty rankings, rookie rankings, all of the best ball content that I got on there, and even a 2024 Dynasty Rookie Guide. So a lot is already on there, and more will be following, the entire summer. So check that out if you guys are interested. And then, the way that I've been kind of doing these is I initially talk about the previous season, the 2023 year. So we'll talk about that for the Dallas Cowboys. And what I like to do, this is my 8th year doing projections now. I like to look at years past, especially if there's been a consistency with the coach and the offensive coordinator. I'm always looking for similarities and things that they might try and do again, or if there's personnel differences, I try and find those and see what's going on here. But last year, 2023, the Dallas Cowboys offense was pretty good. Dak Prescott and the boys, they really surprised a ton of people. And they leaned into throwing the ball. They threw the ball more than they have than they did in 2022. Brian Schottenheimer came in. He's back for 2024. But last year, you can see a huge year for Dak Prescott. As a team, the Cowboys threw 69%, 4,600 yards, 36 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, and they ran the ball still a good amount, but definitely down from the days with Kellen Moore. He had 531 rushing attempts back in 2022, 468 last year. They didn't run the ball very well. 1,900 yards, 4.1 yards per carry, 12 touchdowns, down from 24 the year before, more fumbles. Overall, the offense was a little bit better than it was in 2022. They had more yards, they had more touchdowns. Throwing the ball, but as a unit together, they didn't score as many touchdowns as they did in 2022. So more yards, more passing, just not effective on the ground. So they did have Dak Prescott have an outstanding year, 4,500 yards, 36 touchdowns, 9 picks. Their leading rusher, Tony Pollard, coming off of that foot injury. I think he broke his foot, something in his foot. But he ran for 1,000 yards, but he was very ineffective doing it, under 4 yards per carry. Rico Dowdle actually looked okay as the backup, and he looked good as a receiving back too. He was actually a more efficient receiving back than Tony Pollard. And we'll talk about the running backs when we get there, but it's a huge downgrade. Even though Tony Pollard was ineffective, we're looking at a lesser room here for the Cowboys running back room. And then CeeDee Lamb was the entire offense, 1,700 yards, 12 touchdowns. He even ran the ball for over 100 yards and got another touchdown on the ground. Didn't really have a really good quality number 2 receiver, but Brandon Cooks did catch 8 touchdowns. Towards the end of last year, you saw Jalen Tolbert kind of overhop Michael Gallup for the wide receiver 3 duties. We'll see if he can continue that this season. And then Jake Ferguson was the big surprise here. 761 yards, 71 catches, 5 touchdowns. He's essentially the number 2 receiver for this team. But that's it for 2023 recap. Let's move on to the 2024 Cowboys, and we'll look at the projections here. Starting with the quarterback, Dak Prescott. I see this team having to continue throwing the ball. They don't have the personnel needed to establish the run and really lean on the running game. We're looking at, Ezekiel, Elliott, Rico, Dowdle, Deuce Vaughn, Royce Freeman, and Malik Davis. I think you're going to lean on Dak Prescott again. You're going to see over 600 total attempts for the Dallas Cowboys as a whole. I have Dak Prescott going 405 completions for 595 passing attempts, 43.65 for his yards, 32 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. So I'm having his numbers regress a little bit from 2023. I mean, he had massive highs in all these numbers here. So passing percentage comes down a little bit, yards comes down a little bit, touchdowns come down a little bit, and interceptions went up a little bit. So I still think he's going to be very good, but just not as good as he was last season. I have his rushing numbers improving. He was pretty nice as a runner last year. So 275 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns and a couple fumbles. More or less, I see him doing what he did last year, and you're hoping that they get some growth from some of these younger players, whether it's like Jalen Tolbert, another step forward from Jake Ferguson. Who knows? Maybe there's an extra gear out of CeeDee Lamb. Maybe Brandon Cook's just another year in the system with the chemistry. Maybe he takes a step forward. And then we do want to see if there's a fourth receiver developing. But I think this team continues to lean on Dak as the engine here. And, when they get near the red zone, is Ezekiel Elliott going to be able to run the football in? I don't know. We'll see. If it wouldn't surprise me if Dak does outdo his numbers from last year, 36-9 touchdown interception ratio. But I think there's a slight chance that this Cowboys offense goes sideways a little bit. But either way, Dak Prescott's still a fringe top 5 QB to me. He's probably a better off as a top 10, and he's a very good target for best balls and for redraft right now because he's relatively priced at a discount. So I like getting Dak Prescott when I can right now. But let's move on to the running backs, and this is where the biggest questions are on this Cowboys offense roster right now. They brought back Zeke. You got Rico Dowdle, who looked good in a small part-time role last year. And then I don't know if Deuce Vaughn's going to be able to make any dent in the offense this year, but they also added Royce Freeman, and then Malik Davis is there. I think they're probably adding one more running back to this roster at some point, whether it's a surprise camp cut from someone else's team or if they find somebody else, just lingering on free agency. So I expect them to add to this group yet, but for now, I think you have to expect Ezekiel Elliott to lead this team in carries. And, last year, Tony Pollard was not effective. They gave him 252 carries. He did hit 1,000 yards, almost 4 yards per carry. I think Zeke probably somewhere in that 200 carry range. I have him at 185 carries, 745 yards and 4 touchdowns, which to me seems light. Like if he does take over the entire Tony Pollard workload, this is going to be a pretty light number, but he's priced really cheaply, and I can show you guys where he lands in my projections. But I think there's room for Zeke to grow. In my numbers, I do have him at 27 receptions, 35 targets, 135 receiving yards. I didn't give him a receiving touchdown, but he's been a pretty effective receiver at his time here, especially last year with New England. So I like Zeke. These are kind of floor numbers for me. And, again, if they add someone that's a little bit more touted than a Rico Dowdle, then I might crunch these numbers a little bit. But I have Dowdle coming in and being kind of like a 1B. It's not like the previous regimes where Pollard got, most of the work. I think you're looking at somewhat of a 2/3 split. Zeke gets 2 carries, Dowdle gets the other carry. So I have Dowdle at 105 carries, 435 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. And then I think he's got room to grow on his receiving numbers last year because he was effective, 17 receptions on 22 targets, 144 yards and 2 touchdowns last year. I have his receptions, targets, and yards going up in 2024. So 25 receptions on 35 targets, 185 yards, and a touchdown. So he's going to be effective there. And who knows? Maybe there's a point where Rico Dowdle is the lead back. There's some upside in there. But I think as it sits today, June 12th, you're looking at these guys kind of being a committee, and Zeke probably being the short area yardage kind of guy where if they need someone on 4th and 1, 3rd and 1, or at the goal line, he's probably the pounder. But I wonder if there's something there with Rico Dowdle where he could kind of step in and be like a version of Tony Pollard was a few years back, where Zeke was still a lead back and Pollard looked really good with limited touches. So outside of them, Deuce Vaughn, maybe he takes more work this year. I think Royce Freeman, Malik Davis, those guys are interesting, but it's easy to me to see Zeke and Rico being the main 2 guys. If one of those guys emerges throughout the summer, we'll take note of that. But for now, I kind of just have, backup duties for these guys. I have Deuce Vaughn at 45 carries, Royce Freeman 25, and Malik Davis at 10. So we'll see. I don't feel great about my numbers here. I do want to get Ezekiel Elliott, I think, bumped up a little bit. And even though I'm admitting that I have kind of a low number for him with his touches and his opportunities, but when I filter by PPR here, I do have Ezekiel Elliott coming in at RB 38, and that's kind of where he's being drafted right now. So I do think he's an interesting click right now. Even though he's an older player, I think he's got a little bit more to give this team. And then Rico Dowdle, I do have here at RB 46. So I think these guys are ideal, your RB 3 or 4, more so Zeke and RB 3, Dowdle and RB 4. If you can get them both as your RB 4 or 5, I think that's what looks best. So continue drafting these guys at ADP. I think they're in good shape. But we'll move on to the wide receiver room. And obviously it's led by CeeDee Lamb. breakout year last year. I have his numbers coming down a little bit. I don't know if they can lean on him as much as they did last year, but I still expect him to be the wide receiver 1 on the season. I actually have him as the number 1 player over McCaffrey and some of the other running backs and receivers there. So he is my leading flex player this season, and I think he's worth the 101. But for now, I have him at 128 receptions, 175 targets, about 1,535 yards, and 10 touchdowns. So all those numbers are down from last year, and he's still my number 1 player. And I think there's room to grow here. You know, he could flirt with 2,000 all-purpose yards because he does get the ball on a lot of carries and end arounds and things like that. So I have him at 20 attempts. He was at 14 attempts last year. I think they continue to find creative ways to get him the ball. And then, yeah, rushing yards, 130, and I gave him 1 rushing touchdown on the year. So CeeDee Lamb, man, like there's been drafts where I take him at the 101. Just try to do something different when I'm in best ball drafts right now, but do not be afraid to draft CeeDee Lamb. So he's looking exciting this year. What I'm worried about is the questions at wide receiver 2. Brandon Cooks is there. I think he's on paper. He's the wide receiver 2. He played well last year. He did catch 8 touchdowns. I think he's got room to improve on last year. So I have him at 64 receptions, 95 targets, 785 yards, and 6 touchdowns. And then the big question is wide receiver 3. Can Jalen Tolbert continue where he left off last year? He was able to start overplaying Michael Gallup at various points during the end of the year, and he looked okay. I have him as the number 3 guy here with 45 receptions, 75 targets, 535 yards, and 3 touchdowns. But, you know, there's been some buzz about the draft pick, Ryan Flournoy. He might have been an undrafted free agent, but Ryan Flournoy is pretty decent. And Jalen Brooks is another guy that I've seen some buzz on. So those 2 are the ones I'm looking for. I do like Kevontae Turpin, as Charlene mentions him in the chat. He's a fun player. He's going to get some special teams opportunities. And last year, he did have a few plays as well as a receiver. He did have 12 catches for 18 targets, and he scored 3 touchdowns. So I probably need to give him some more work too, because he's a fun player to scheme things up for. But I like the potential for a wide receiver 4 to emerge here between Flournoy, Turpin, and Jalen Brooks. But overall, you're taking CeeDee Lamb at pick 1 or 2 in your drafts right now. I think Brandon Cooks is fine as like a wide receiver 4 or 5 depth piece. You know, someone you can flex on bye weeks, or if you can put him in there for an injured player for a week or 2. But then Tolbert's the sneaky one. I think he's a best ball guy. I don't know if you're ever going to feel comfortable starting him in a redraft, but keep him in mind. He's really cheap right now. And you know, if you're doing a CeeDee Lamb, Dak Prescott stack, tack him on there because he's going to have some games where he plays well. And then maybe some deep end, you know, last pick shots on either Turpin or Brooks or even Flournoy at that point. But I like the receiving group. I think it's going to be better than it was last year, and it can help Dak Prescott quite a bit. And hey, yeah, so this is officially the time where I'm going to start ramping up my content for the upcoming season. I do have a live stream going on tonight. We're starting that at 7 p.m. Central Time, roughly. We're going to do a live best ball draft. And then I think the plan tomorrow night is to do our first ESPN mock draft, a live mock draft, opening it up and seeing what all the ADPs and things are like that. So we're here. It's time to start ramping up the 2024 draft content. So we'll move on and finish with the tight end group here. Last year, I was all over Jake Ferguson. He was one of my most drafted players. I had him on several of my teams and did pretty well with that value there. And he's the clear tight end 1 on this team. I think he's also the clear wide receiver 2 on this team. I have him second in targets behind CeeDee Lamb with 115 targets, 78 catches, 855 yards, and 7 touchdowns. I think he's a guy that has clear growth coming in this season, and he was really coming on strong at the end of last year. I think he's got another gear in him yet. I do think he's got top 5 tight end potential. And for where he's being drafted, you know, 7th, 8th round, I like pulling him there. I think he's going to be a very consistent option and a guy that you're happy with that you took on your fantasy teams this year. So outside of him, they got Luke Shoemaker for year 2. And he was injured a lot last year. He missed part of the offseason. I think he just kind of got put behind. And Jake Ferguson was able to just stay healthy and just put his foot on the gas and run away with the job. But you got Shoemaker here, the number 2 tight end, 12 receptions, 20 targets, 115 yards, and a touchdown. And then we'll see if Peyton Hendershot can do anything. But it's all about Jake Ferguson. I think he's in for a pretty nice season. And that's pretty much it. We'll do the reviews real quick. We'll finish up with where everyone's being ranked. I mentioned before I have CeeDee Lamb as the wide receiver 1. I also have him as the number 1 player in terms of receivers and running backs this year. So I love CeeDee Lamb as the 101. If I go down a little bit here, I have Brandon Cooks at wide receiver 45. So, he can be your number 3 or a flex player for you various times throughout the year. I go down a little bit farther. Let's see. And it's like I mentioned wide receiver 3 is going to be a part for Dallas to really develop here. But Jalen Tolbert around wide receiver 81. And then the tight ends, let's see. I got Ferguson at tight end 7. So I'm feeling pretty good about him being a fringe top 5, for sure, top 10 tight end as long as he stays healthy. But yeah, I'm excited. I think Dallas, they had the quiet offseason. They got a lot to prove this year. But I think just building off of what they did last year with Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb and kind of making that the identity of their offense, it might open things up for the run. You still have Jake Ferguson, up the seamer as an outlet. And we're just waiting for whether it's Brandon Cooks, Jalen Tolbert, one of the other receivers we mentioned, to kind of take more off of the plate there of some of the other players. And we'll see if they can run the ball. I think that's one of the interesting things. Let's see. I think tomorrow, I'm not quite sure. I have to confirm that. Tonight's episode is going to be at about an hour and a half at 7 p.m. Central Time. Depends on when the lobby fills. But I think tomorrow is probably going to be either at 6 or 7 p.m. Central Time. I'll confirm that, and I'll make sure I post it live. I'll get that uploaded live so you can see what time. But definitely tomorrow night, either 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. I will double check with my guy there. But either way, that's it for the Dallas Cowboys. Thank you for watching. Check out the live stream later this evening. And yeah, hope to see you guys there. Peace.